have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Well, let's start our story today with states' rights, because states' rights was the main weapon wielded against the landmark Civil Rights Bill 50 years ago. Now, states' rights is supposed to serve as a check and balance on federal power, ensuring that governing stays close to the people and reflects our needs. But like any good thing, states' rights can be corrupted. They can even get used to abet tyranny and terrorism. And that's exactly what happened on race in this country throughout most of its history. States' rights became the excuse, the protective shield behind which white folks exploited people of color for economic gain and ego-stroking privileges. States' rights sheltered lynchers and rapists from the justice system and turned Southern courts into a laughingstock. States' rights blessed whites-only signs, fake literacy tests, voter intimidation, and racial housing covenants. When states' rights was allowed to trump human rights, this nation's image as a beacon for democracy plummeted. Now, the civil rights movement pleaded with the federal government, please step up to the plate and enforce a constitution that promises equality under the law. Activists like Martin Luther King put America's dirty racial laundry into the news for the world to see. And in mid-1963, the feds finally put forth a civil rights bill, hoping to repair America's racial image during the Cold War. The 1964 Civil Rights Act curtailed the ability of states to shield racism. It outlawed discrimination in employment and public accommodations on the basis of race, religion, and gender. And it made the feds the enforcer when the states refused. And guess where Idahoans stood on that measure? Let me ask you, how many of you would guess that most Idahoans stood in favor of the Civil Rights Bill 50 years ago? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you think that most Idahoans stood with the states' rights forces in opposition to the bill? All right, interesting. Well, let's take a look at this story because it's going to tell us two interesting things about Idaho. First, it's going to tell us what Idaho tends to favor when states' rights clashes with human rights. And by human rights, I'm talking about the ones we all can read down at the Anne Frank Memorial. Second, it'll shed a little more light on the source of our state's image issues with race. Okay, so let's answer the question. Where did Idaho stand on the landmark Civil Rights Bill in 1964? Well, if you look just at the votes of Idaho's congressional delegation in DC, it was 100% in favor. Their votes put Idaho publicly on the right side of history. And it was a bipartisan group that included Senators Frank Church and Len Jordan, a Democrat and a Republican, and Representatives Compton White Jr. and Ralph Harding, both Democrats. Now, these four favored states' rights, yet they felt the federal government had to enforce equal treatment of citizens when the states refused. They were independent thinkers with the gumption to do the right thing regardless of pressures to act otherwise. Now, on the flip side, these four were definitely hard-pressed to do otherwise by their own constituents. Based upon the mail they got, Idahoans were overwhelmingly and vociferously against the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. And frankly, that surprised me. Back then, Idaho's black population was 0.2%. So why would white folks get all flustered and frightened by it? But they were. All four congressmen amassed thick files of correspondence. Church said his mail was running 10-to-1 against the bill at one point. My own survey of Compton White's letters put his at around 71% opposed and 29% in favor. And if you read the letters, it's clear. A majority of Idahoans who wrote in wanted to align Idaho with the South in a states' rights fight against the feds on civil rights. And sadly, just like Southerners, they often wove their anti-federal government arguments with blatant appeals to preserve white people's option to discriminate. Now, there were some constituents who very carefully and effectively separated their small government values from racial motivations, but most did not. Personal liberty included the right to exclude for many. In 1963, big segregationist lobbies courted Idahoans too, for our state already had a reputation down south for being an ally against federal civil rights bills. And this reputation, gang, goes all the way back to the 1920s when Idaho Senator William Borah led the states' rights fight against federal anti-lynching legislation. He was the main oppositional voice outside the South for 18 years. As a result, Southerners loved him, and that love could be leveraged into electoral votes should Borah run for president. By the way, Borah also blended states' rights talk with racial commentary. He said, for example, it was a mistake to give black men the vote with the 15th Amendment. They weren't fit for it, and it should be repealed. Flash forward now to 1964. Two Dixiecrat lobbies created to kill the Civil Rights Bill reached out to Idaho as a place that favored states' rights. The most powerful lobby called itself, get this name, gang, the Coordinating Committee on Fundamental American Freedoms. Its money came largely from the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, a state agency with connections to the Ku Klux Klan. That organization flooded Idaho's newspapers with ads and mailboxes with pamphlets. They called the Civil Rights Bill a totalitarian conspiracy set on destroying the Constitution, crushing free enterprise, and erasing white liberties, all under the false cloak of minority rights. Now, these scare tactics were a crock, but many Idahoans fell for them, largely because they were already primed to think that way before the Southerners came calling. Here are some examples of Idahoans who opposed the Federal Civil Rights Bill of 1964. The Sandpoint, Kimberly, and Haley Chambers of Commerce each came out publicly against it. So did the Idaho Farm Bureau, which sponsored an aggressive letter-writing campaign of its own. Oppositional letters also arrived under the names of the Canyon County Republican Booster Club, the Idaho Women's Christian Temperance Union, and American Legion Auxiliary in Lewiston, the Sun Valley Business and Professional Women's Club, the Gooding JCs, the City of Glens Ferry, and a Ricks College Sunday School class. They appeared on stationery from law and doctors' offices, as well as from lifelong Democrats and union workers. Like Southerners, Idahoans often blended a states and property rights position with explicit racial prejudices. Some even confidently proclaimed that God had cursed blacks, that God was opposed to civil rights bills and would smite race mixers. For example, farmers in Hazleton renamed their local farm bureau the First Segregation Farm Bureau of Hazleton in reaction to the bill. A Coeur d'Alene woman claimed the bill would create a police state to mix the races. Although Idaho's schools had been open to all children since 1873, a Parma man wrote, quote, "I am completely against having Negroes forced in with our white children," end quote. A couple in Napa added, quote, "This bill would be a gross discrimination against the white race. Any person who tried to better himself could do so if he just used some of his own initiative. Charity has to stop somewhere," end quote. As one Idahoan told Senator Church, The civil rights crisis was an issue on which Western and Southern interests coincided. Many letters echoed the talking points in the Mississippi-funded literature, such as this bill was 90% federal control and only 10% civil rights. Even Senator Church noticed how easily and forcefully Idahoans were parroting Mississippi. His team wrote back to try to rebut all the false claims. Church even emphasized that because Idaho was one of 28 non-Southern states that already had its own civil rights law, which the legislature passed quietly in 1961, the federal law would actually have very little effect here. Now, many Idahoans either didn't realize a state law already sat on the books, or else they feared, rightly, that the feds were going to enforce theirs more fully, for their letters fumed that the government could actually make them interact with blacks in a non-discriminatory manner. Equality of opportunity had to be earned, many presumed. The owner of a milling company in Tarrenton wrote, quote, "The standard of colored people's performance in social living must be brought up to the white man's standard, and then there will be acceptance and brotherly love," end quote. Providing blacks with equal education was fine, but protecting the right of whites to live in white-only neighborhoods was vital to him and his neighbors. He then warned Church. He said, quote, "We expect you to vote for the good of the country now, and not in a manner to soothe the minorities," end quote. A farmer in Hazleton echoed that, yeah, while allowing blacks to vote and attend school was fine, they should earn the right to integrate as other groups have, end quote. Several letters complained that blacks were demanding rights on a national stage rather than patiently waiting for incremental progress. And yet many also praised how their own white forebears forcefully protected their own liberty. I guess that was patriotism. Writers feared losing their privileges. The employees of a refrigeration shop in Twin Falls felt that rights were being stripped from whites to be given to blacks. A Weezer man stressed, quote, "If this bill was designed to help the Negro, he don't need it if it's going to take so many of our rights and liberties away and make it impossible to conduct our own private affairs as freely as we've done in the past," end quote. A woman from Twin Falls insisted, quote, "Negro leaders are not demanding civil rights, they're demanding special privileges," end quote. Even children from a youth and democracy class in Notice, Idaho echoed, quote, "The Negro must learn to help himself. We don't believe any race minority should be given special privileges. The jobs are there if Negroes would take advantage of them," end quote. A couple from Jerome added, "Oh, unless we are Negroes, we haven't any rights at all," end quote. Specifically, they wanted the option to reject dealing with blacks. A lifelong Union Democrat from Pocatello stated outright that whites would lose home value if they could not discriminate racially when selling or renting. A Presbyterian leader in Wendell wrote that rumors of forced neighborhood race mixing had sent her community into, quote, "a near panic," end quote. Democrats and Republicans alike threatened to vote against their elected officials if they supported this bill. By December 1963, Frank Church was so overwhelmed by the flood of negative letters, he appealed to local organizations to help him counter the tide. He said, quote, "There is no voice in Idaho to present the facts, let alone try to convince people to take a strong stand on civil rights," end quote. The Civil Rights Act did become law in July 1964 with the help of Idaho's brave congressional delegation. But constituent mail revealed another reality that took shape in the next election cycles. In 1966, voters replaced Democrats Ralph Harding and Compton White with conservatives George Hansen and James McClure. Both those men fiercely opposed federal civil rights laws. Both spoke for people who did not like Martin Luther King or the Fair Housing Act of 1968, when once again Idahoans' letters against that legislation far outnumbered those in favor. Passionate resistance against fair housing laws swelled across a state whose tiny black population clustered in segregated sections of Boise and Pocatello. Also in 1968, Idahoans gave the racist Alabaman George Wallace the second highest percentage of votes for president that he received throughout the West. By then, ladies and gentlemen, by 1968, the founder of the Aryan nations was starting to visit our state. Richard Butler and his wife Betty vacationed in Idaho for years before buying property up north for a white supremacist compound in 1974. They watched Idaho, and they interacted with the people. Like the flood of white flighters who would follow from California, Butler felt confident that Idaho was a good fit for him. Hey, if Idahoans lacked his extreme religious views and fondness for racial violence, many still talked privately as if they sat on his side of middle. Now, Idahoans clearly condemned the gang-like criminality of Butler's group, and they deeply resented the negative reputation he gave our state. By the 1980s, blatant racism was bad for business, tourism, and universities. Despite this, Idaho was among the last 5 states in the Union to pass a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday in 1990. And the main reason then was to dispel Idaho's bad racial image. I think Idahoans still largely fixate on Butler and the Aryan nations when we discuss our state's racial past. We blame him for our bad image. We then declare our innocence and then downplay our own homegrown problems. As a result, elected officials seem perfectly content making superficial gestures toward minority rights. Meanwhile, they still let states' rights trump human rights. They cite political expediency to justify discrimination and disinterest towards certain groups. We see this now in refusals to add the words sexual orientation and gender identity to Idaho's Human Rights Act, let alone let gay folks marry. We see it in resistance to Medicaid expansion. We see it in resistance to Medicaid expansion amid shamefully low wages. States' rights can become a cruel tyranny to those who are excluded from their state's protection and concern. Only courageous action now on human rights will remake our image and put this state on the right side of history when we look back again in 50 years. Thank you.